funerals double about every 10 years. So for example, if today's funeral is $10,000, 10 years from now, that's going to be about $20,000.
Welcome to Critical Thinking Required, hosted by LBW. This podcast is intended for free thinkers, entrepreneurs, and knowledge seekers. Join us as we discuss relevant financial topics, explore with guests their financial journeys, and engage with experts in industries such as space, media and entertainment, real estate, and many more. Buckle up and enjoy the ride. Welcome to Critical Thinking Required. You're with your hosts, myself, Tim Bickmore, and my two colleagues, Dan Weiss and Nathaniel Leach. And today we have a guest, Robert Sheck. Robert, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Before I jump into Robert's bio, so all of our listeners know exactly who we're speaking with today, I would just like to say, if you do enjoy our podcast, please like, share, and subscribe to our podcast channels. And I'm going to jump into Robert's bio quick, and so all of our listeners can understand exactly who we're speaking with. So Robert is a lifetime resident of the Chicago area. While attending Worsham College of Mortuary Science, he served as an apprentice at Weinstein Piser Funeral Home, and upon graduation became a funeral director. Through the tragic and untimely death of his own father, Robert came to understand how truly difficult it is when a loved one passes away. This gave him the strength, compassion, and knowledge to help families during one of the toughest times of their lives. As a proud part of the team for 32 years, Robert has helped more than 3,500 families during the difficult experience of losing a loved one. He provides and coordinates catered services to each family to ensure their needs are properly met, and says, "My main goal is hoping that I can ease some of the pain that our families are going through." Through numerous speaking engagements at synagogues and schools, Robert has educated many people about death, dying, and funeral arrangements. He was a former member of a congregational Beth Shalom in Northbrook and Beth M of Buffalo Grove. He is currently a member of the Jewish Funeral Directors Association, as well as a board member of the B'nai B'rith Sport Lodge, and lives in Long Grove with his wife and two children. Robert, again, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Sounds great. Good to be here.
So I'm the lucky one. I get to start off some questions today. And at LBW, my role is financial planning. I do a lot of it. Dan and I help a lot of our clients with a litany of different experiences and things that come financially. And one thing that we do deal with is funeral expenses, pre-funeral expenses, what people should prepare for, but also in untimely deaths that people do experience. So my first question for you is, if you're pre-planning for a funeral expense, and it always comes for all of us, it has to, what should be considered? What would you sit down and talk to people about considering, about planning for their untimely demise?
Well, it's a great question. So there's two aspects about pre-planning or thinking about funeral services. So typically you'll have people that will tell their families or loved ones, I have everything prepared, and that might just mean that they have a cemetery property in mind, or that they purchased ahead of time. But what they don't have is they don't have the other part, which is the funeral expense or the funeral service, right? So I always like to correlate things. You should have the cemetery side and you should have the funeral side pre-planned for a future date. It goes hand in hand. It's sort of like Chinese food, right? The rice and the, Mongolian beef, they go together. So you always want to plan for that. But typically the majority of the people, they only have the cemetery side. So that's what's missing on basically pre-planning, which is really important to do, because you're only getting half of the, basically selecting your choices, but you're going to be then leaving the really hard portion to your family members and your children.
Just out of curiosity, on average, just like for the average individual, right? And I know there are certain circumstances where this may change. At what time do you feel it's the appropriate age to really start considering these type of plans?
That's a great question. So really the younger that you do it, the better off you are. And what's really very interesting about my company that I work for. So my company is a very large conglomerate of funeral services provider. We're the largest in North America. So you can go ahead and pre-plan your services at any time, because what you're doing is you're purchasing an insurance policy, and that policy then gives you the right at some later date to have those services. So of course, like anything, you purchase something for $5,000 today and you have to use it 25, 30 years later. Well, that might be costing you $15,000, $20,000 later. So there is no wrong or right time to do it, just when you're able to sit down and speak about death, that's the hardest part.
Robert, could you, for example, run through an example of what these kind of items that need to be planned for could look like? If you could do it in one breath, that'd be very impressive.
Sure.
Do you think you can put that together as to what does a package look like? What do people need to consider or can consider?
Right. So what you need to consider is, if you're starting completely fresh and you have nothing, so you want to consider about what type of service do you want for yourself? Do you want to be cremated? Do you want to be buried? Those are the two choices that you would have, right? So let's say burial. So if you have burial, then what do? Well, you're going to find a cemetery that you possibly know of. And a lot of it is determined by family history, right? There's family generations that might be there, that you might want to be with your parents that are somewhere. So then when you make that selection, then you're going to go ahead and make your selection for your funeral services. And what that would be is, what would you like your service to look like? And would you want to have a chapel service? Do you want to have a service just at the cemetery? Do you want to have a visitation, and then you want to have a service at the funeral home, and then go to a church or synagogue, depending on your denomination, right? So those are the things that you have to think about. Then from there, the process actually becomes very simple. It's a very simple process, that then you're going to select what casket you want to have, what maybe type of clothing that you want to be dressed in. Depending on your religion, there's usually embalming that might be taking place, or you're going to have more of a traditional type service, which will lead to different options that you have. So those are the things that people need to think about.
So I've got a follow up to that, Robert. With the insurance policy, is that bought directly from SCI, or is that bought through are you guys partnering with an insurance company, or do you direct them to a particular insurance company to buy from? And then depending on whatever those answers are, I'm just curious, like, what's stopping somebody from going to any insurance company and buying an insurance policy that just covers the cost of a funeral at some point in the future, and then just applying those proceeds within your chain's locations?
Right. So it's a great question that comes up quite a bit with people that, let's say, they have the funds to purchase a funeral. So first part of your question is, if you purchase a policy somewhere else, let's say you buy you'll see on advertising on TV, right? $10,000 funeral policy, you can use that for your funeral expenses. The problem with that is the rate that the increasing of the industry is happening in the funeral expenses is not going to cover that policy. So when you come to Weinstein and Piser, you're selecting everything through us for what our standard general price list is. There's a GPL in the industry that everybody must have a GPL be given to them when you're speaking to a funeral home. That's the law. In that GPL is going to have what our prices consist of for what you're going to select. So that then we fund that funeral service through Assurance Solution, which is a funding for funeral services policies. And what that does is they actually hold the funds. So the money is not held at our firm. So if we are not in business, that policy can be utilized at any other funeral home that you desire at that time. So that's another avenue by protecting a consumer. The other aspect is that, like I said, the cost of what you're going to purchase today is going to cover the expenses 10 years from now. Funerals double about every 10 years. So for example, if today's funeral is $10,000, 10 years from now, that's going to be about $20,000. The policy that you might go select outside probably isn't going to cover as much as that. Yes. Can you select a much higher insurance policy to do that? Sure, you can. But what's happening with that is then we miss the whole aspect about what prearranging is. It's not just to cover expenses. It's also to make sure that your family is not burdened with decision making. So if, right, you got your parents, if they haven't made any decisions and, one of them passed away, yes, the spouse might take care of that, or they're going to bring you in and ask you questions. And what do you think dad would like? Do you think he would like this casket? Do you think that he wants to be in this, in this suit? At that time, do you really want to be making those type of decisions? Probably not. You're not in your state of mind. So that's why you want to pre-plan.
Just a comment on that. I'm so glad that you said something about that. When we have these conversations, it's not usually the money that people fight about in these situations. It's the in my family, it was the necklace that my great grandmother wore for her entire life that probably had no monetary value at all, but it's that she wore it, right?
Right.
It's always seems to be those sentimental things, or does this person get this red or not, that doesn't get dictated because everybody thinks about, well, who gets the money, and that's what people are going to care about. It's not usually that.
Right. Yeah, and that's the main thing too that we see. It's not about necessarily the money. It might come down to the money when you're making the prearrangement, just because of the cost factor. But really, it's more of making decision makings of what they want. Or the main thing is a lot of people that make prearrangements, which is great that they say they don't want to leave this to their children. So because maybe the children might not select this space or this cemetery or this type of service, and if they're the last parent, that's a big burden to put on a child or children to make those decisions.
Robert, you alluded to that costs double every 10 years. So that's, by my math, that's like a 7.2% annualized growth rate. Can you go into more depth on what those costs, why are costs increasing so much? Like what are the biggest drivers of those cost increases in the funeral industry?
Sure. So you have two parts of funeral cost. As I explained earlier, you have cemetery cost and you have funeral home cost. The cemetery cost, that goes up quite a bit, right? So and what I mean by that cost is, after somebody passes away, you're going to have to go to that cemetery to be buried. And that cemetery will charge you a fee to open and close the grave. In the industry, it's called O&C. That's open and close the grave. So they have a fee. So for example, Shalom Memorial Park, their fee is around $3,800 to open and close the grave. I got in the business 32 years ago. That was about $895. So you can see how fast that increases over time. So the cemeteries generally, they will all raise their rate every year. Once a year, there is some sort of increase. So on the funeral side, there are some funeral homes, they haven't raised any rate in say 3 years or 5 years, depending on the funeral home. So you have the cost factors of operations, you have cost factors of manufacturers of caskets. You have here in Chicago, there is part of a union. So you have cost of labor, which is a tremendous amount of cost. So those increases are going to be added to the bottom line of funeral expenses. Besides just all your cash advance items that never go to a funeral home. But on the bottom line, when somebody makes an arrangement, and let's say it's $10,000, everybody says to you, how much did a funeral cost? How much did your dad spend? Oh man, we spent like $12,000. But what people fail to realize is, and they don't tell the whole story, is that the funeral home didn't get all $12,000. They might have included the cemetery cost to that. There's clergy cost, right? There's death notice cost. There's death certificates. So if you look and break everything down, a funeral home might get, say $6,000, $7,000 of that $12,000 cost. right? So it's not what people really feel that the total is. I understand the total is the total, but we have to break down who's getting that money.
Interesting. So essentially you're leading as the quarterback and you kind of, or like general contractor of the funeral, kind of leading the group. And then everything, I'm assuming, gets billed through you typically. And then you bill out like a subcontractor, the funeral, opening the graves, not the clergy, all of that. Is that kind of how that functions?
Yeah. I mean, if you want to look at it, maybe a little better terminology, like an event planner,
Yeah.
sort of, right? So we're an event planner, just on a sad occasion, not a big occasion, but it's the same aspect. So we'll order your flowers for you. If you want to have a limousine, we'll order your limousine. If you want us to get your clergy, we'll get a clergy for you. If you have a clergy, that's fine. We do everything from A to Z. The majority from like maybe A to F is all the funeral homes. So you'll have our professional service fee involved in there. You'll have the removal, the transportation, the preparation, washing, cleansing, dressing the person, and then whatever casket you're going to select. So really that's our cost. After that, we're just, we're sending out the funds to somebody else. So we collect it all for somebody and then we pay it out.
Interesting. So the question, my next question I have, and this might be stepping a little bit on Nathaniel's toes, but it's not quite in the realm of what he may ask, is I'm curious from the like generational. So millennials get a lot of conversation about how we change industries, right? Like the millennials are changing industries in a lot of different ways. I'm just curious on the young. I'm curious on how the younger generation is affecting the funeral service business. Like, are they saying, like, are you anticipating that millennials want something different in funerals? Is it less as of a production? Is it the same kind of production? Just out of curiosity from a generational standpoint, or are they just not old enough to really start participating within that type of planning?
Well, so Tim, it's a great question because you say, so the millennials, right? Which is going to be making the decisions for their parents if the parents haven't made decisions what to do. So the first thing with the millennials are that we're losing traditions, right? So we're losing the traditions of the millennials because they're not going into their church. They're not going into their organization. They're not going to their synagogue. They're all spread out throughout the United States. Before, everybody was all in one state. Their parents were here, they're buried here. So now they're also being dispersed other places. So the millennials are changing how we do business, meaning exactly what we're doing today, right? We're doing podcasts, we're doing Zoom, we're doing WebEx. This is how sometimes, which is a whole different subject, but COVID, when that came into place, how we were making arrangements for people over the phone, by face-to-face, with technology. The millennials, what they want now is they want more of a celebration of life. They want celebrating of their parents, or, if God forbid one of them passed away. So our company is so forward thinking with this process that our funeral homes are going to have sort of like event rooms, right? So let's say your typical service would be a visitation. So the visitation might be set up in the chapel, but this chapel is going to have a special name for it. And there's going to be like tabletops and tablecloths on it, like an event. And that's what the millennials are moving towards to, not your old traditional way.
Can you talk about a little bit about the emotions involved with doing your role and the other roles within this process? It's obviously a very difficult time. You're wearing different hats. What does that hat look like?
So let's say, for example, we have a death call, right? And the death call is somebody that is 32 years of age, has a wife and 2 young children, and just passed away from a heart attack. The emotions are running rampant, right? So maybe we have parents on both sides. So the in-laws are still living. The emotion of the wife is just not even close to there. So maybe the wife has a sibling, right? A sister, a brother. Those are the ones that might be able to step up and help that family bury this individual that just passed, even with the parents. So maybe the parents of that individual that passed, their emotions are just as much as the wife is. Very difficult to try to arrange something for them because of the situation, how unexpected this death has occurred. So much different than if I'm going to be wearing my hat and now somebody was 92 years of age, lived a full life. This is, somebody that we're going to be celebrating, a long time, major organizations involved, lots of friends, so on and so on. So the emotion aspect is much different because maybe it was like leading up to that person's death, right? So they might have been sick and they might have been for a little while and then they passed. So imagine the two different emotions that's happening right there in that room, right? Typically would be making the arrangements in the funeral. Much different. So
that makes me curious as to how do you see so much stuff? This is heavy material. How do you psychologically deal with this?
It's a great question, right? Yeah, personally. So I like to joke a lot, right? I need to laugh. Laughter is a great medicine. So even though my family will tell you I don't really tell, my jokes great, but I think I do. But, that's somebody's opinion. But the other thing is it's funny you asked that, Dan, because people will say to you, I really don't understand how you can do this. It's always sad. No, it's not always sad. There are a lot of great people that have lived a long time, and it's a great celebration for them. Yes. Is there ones that are completely sad and completely unexpected? Yeah. How do I deal with that? I try to put myself in their shoes and thinking that they need somebody. They need somebody with guidance. They need somebody that's educated, somebody that understands their pain. I understand their pain. I get that. Maybe, that my father, passed away from suicide. I look at it a little differently. For me personally, it was more of like a weight was lifted off when my father did pass because of all what he was going through. So for somebody in this situation, I could understand what they're feeling, not to the total extent that they're feeling, but I'm going to do everything I can to get them through this process and have a dignified funeral service and provide something for them that you're going to have. It doesn't matter. It don't matter if we do it now or we do it for 50 years from now. We're still going to have to deal with it.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that's a very powerful motivator. There's a lot of similarities. You and I have talked a little bit about this before, between our industry and yours. Tim and I particularly talk about this a lot because we end up seeing across the nation clients more so than Nathaniel doesn't travel with us all the time. And I think he would probably agree with me on this. I think we spent enough time together that I probably could say this, that if not our greatest reward, one of our greatest rewards is the embracing of different people, their cultures, their backgrounds, their lifestyles, and how much that grows us and how much we've learned from that. And I would have to imagine that you two have experienced a very similar feeling, because you have to embrace so many different cultures, lifestyles, and people. Can you share some of that experience, assuming that is the case?
Sure. It's the total case. I mean, I agree with you. Our industries are very similar because actually our industries are so similar because it's the unknown, right? I think two things are very difficult. Talking about funeral services and death, and then also talking about money, because money can really affect people, how they live, how they act, what they do. So very similar. With us and myself, personal experiences, I've dealt with many different individuals, different type of backgrounds, different type of religions. And the main thing is that it all comes back to the same process. There's still going to be a disposition of a human body. So you just have to know different people's religions. You just have to know different type of backgrounds that they come from. but they're all selecting the same type of services, just might be in a little different format, right? So my Asian community that I've dealt with, it's sort of like they kind of take things on their own hand and lead you a certain way that they want to make sure that they feel comfortable with you and how they go ahead and make selections. As much as my Jewish families, it's the same thing. So we have in the Jewish faith, there's major differences. You have Orthodox, you have traditional people, you have conservative people, and you have Reform people. So they all have different aspects of how they're going to select a funeral service, but in the end, we're all going to a cemetery to be cremated or to be buried. And then there's also the aspect about cremation. So yeah.
That's all very fascinating. Switching gears a little bit, I'd like to talk a little bit about the kind of the management of a funeral home. Can you maybe discuss any general thoughts you may have on that subject, as well as I'm curious. So you're owned by your funeral home is owned by a conglomerate. Was it always so when you first started there? And can you maybe talk a little bit about the differences between a family-owned, like an independent funeral home, versus the corporate-owned conglomerate that you are a part of?
Mm-hmm. So, just want to make sure that everybody understands and it's clear. So, even if you're independent or you're a corporation, you're still a corporation, right? Independents are going to be incorporated. They're going to be incorporated.
Of course.
Right. So the aspect is, I was part of a family-owned business when I first got into the business. Then the family sold in 1995. I started in 1989. So in 1995, family sold their business, which was one of a very large conglomerate type funeral home. And that funeral home actually went through a bankruptcy period and then merged out of bankruptcy. And then later years down the road, I believe like around 2004 or 5, was bought by my existing company now. So the difference between family and our company is that we all sort of wear the same hats. The difference in a family business is you have to do all of it, right? So you have to be the manager, you have to be the owner, you have to be the advertiser, you have to be, casket purchasing. In our company, I have a whole backside that takes care of all that, right? So I have somebody that will handle all the advertising, somebody that will handle all the purchasing. So what does that do as us at our locations? As managers and funeral directors, it allows me to get more personal with families. It allows me to get more personal with people outside the funeral home because I have a whole team that's behind me, that's backing me and our firm to move forward. I think a perfect example is COVID. So COVID sets into March, and our company was able to adapt extremely fast, right? So what happened is we set up WebEx, we set up DocuSign. We adapted so quickly that I think our clients, they didn't feel any stalling, any delays, because our company was able to do that behind the scenes, where some independents became very difficult. They were still trying to have their families come into their funeral home because they had no other ways to do it, or they were getting maybe overwhelmed because maybe some of their business was increasing, but they didn't know how to handle it, or they didn't have people to take care of that for them. So that's what I like about a larger firm that can handle all those things, plus all the aspects that we provide of transferability and relocation. We can do all those things.
Since you brought it up, Robert, the COVID experience, if we can call it that, I mean, having, and just the emotions coming in, having to limit how many people come to a service and the extra precautions you had to come into play. What was that like? The challenges behind that from a business standpoint, from an emotional standpoint? I mean, I imagine COVID impacted your industry significantly more than most.
Sure. I mean, definitely, has impacted of how people made selections, how people mourn their death, right? So couldn't have people inside the chapel, or we were very limited in the beginning, and then there was nothing inside the chapel. People started just doing services outside because we were under restrictions of state guidelines, and with the CDC's recommendations, we were only allowed 10 people in our funeral home. So more people decided to have services outside because they didn't feel comfortable coming into the home initially. But one thing that I have to praise my company is that we learned from other states that were extremely much more difficult with the COVID cases, especially like in New York. So we have lots of firms in New York, and those firms, the overwhelming that was going on there was just astronomical for funeral directors and for families. Our firm, actually, we sent people up to New York to help them out, even though that we were still somewhat, overwhelmed ourselves, but we felt that we need to help them to take care of the families that were coming through their doors, because people were passing away at, unrealistic numbers. So, but we learned what was going on in New York, how we are going to handle it here in Chicago. And that helped tremendously. So it helped with how we're going to make a transfer, how we are going to let somebody's family member see their loved one, even though that they did have COVID, right? Because in the beginning, people didn't really understand how it was being transmitted, right? So we always I go back to the age of, the time when AIDS was pretty much happening. As funeral directors then, funeral directors were more scared of AIDS than they were of, say, COVID, because AIDS, we just really had no idea how the transmission was happening compared to, COVID. So, but it changed. And I think it changed where things are going to stay somewhat the same, meaning that people might still feel comfortable of just talking over the phone. Or, I think what one good thing is, people that were able to now, where things are back open up, they could go ahead and make decisions from their home. They don't necessarily have to come into the funeral home. So we adapted onto our website. You can go to our website. You can look at certain services that we provide, or caskets, things like that. It gives people much more, as we spoke before with these millennials, they like that type of way of doing business. So we just have to adapt.
It's so interesting. I feel like I would love to ask the general public how many people thought COVID changed the funeral business, and in what type of ways, which it's fascinating to hear how you guys have evolved. And it's fascinating to hear that because of the corporation having multiple offices, you were able to gain intelligence and adjust and shift, which is fantastic, and also great to be part of a larger corporation. To kind of go into closing remarks, and I'll start and then throw it over to Nathaniel. Robert, I think my final thoughts is nuance. I think a lot of people don't dive into the funeral type of subject because people don't like to talk about their death. We find that a lot through estate planning. But B, there's a lot of intricacies that go into the plan. And when you said event planning, I should have made that analogy right off the bat. I hate event planning. I despise it. I've done it for different organizations, and it's just not my thing. And so it'd be wonderful to have somebody who understands how to do it, because good event planners are a game changer. Like they truly are. It is important. And if something like your funeral is important to you, you should really plan it out. You really should understand how that affects, because sometimes those wishes aren't necessarily put together because you never had the conversation about it,
right?
And encouraging it. So I think that's where I'd kind of leave it off, is just the nuance and making sure that you just kind of have the courage to talk about the potential demise of yourself and what would you like, because it is important at the end of the day. So I appreciate your thoughts. Nathaniel, do you got anything for us?
I really commend you, Robert, for the job that you do today, in terms of, I can't possibly imagine the emotional ups and downs that you have to, that are portrayed to you from the aggrieved, and then not only those that you experience for yourself. So joking about it, I think, is not joking about it or death, your job, but making jokes, I think, is an extremely healthy outlet. I also found it interesting about the insurance conversation. I didn't know some of that, honestly. That's not really my ball game as it is for Tim and Dan, but very interesting.
Heal with humor, right? People are afraid of their own mortality. That's very reasonable. Just they're afraid. I'd like to see where it scales up in reality to public speaking and the unknown. We see that, you mentioned it. The unknown is a very, very scary, uncomfortable place. It's worse than bad news often, because at least you know what to expect with bad news. And I really appreciate you sharing the personal touch, because this event is an experience that is often not held for necessarily the person that you're putting into the ground, or it's for the people that are left over. And just you sharing some of the personal stories with your own father and why you're doing this, you want to have an environment that's going to welcome people back for many years to visit where they laid that loved one down. And I think that's just extremely important and such a difference maker, right? The people always make the difference. And so it's very comforting knowing how you treat your work and how important that is to people. Yeah, I mean, Ben Franklin said it, right? In this world, nothing is certain except death and taxes.
That's exactly right. I mean, I appreciate all the kind words, and all I could say is the last thing would be, no matter if there's one person for the funeral service or 1,000, you should still eulogize and remember that person for who they were. And that's really what it's about. I mean, I've seen all extreme. I've seen 0 people at somebody's funeral, and I've been on a funeral service there was about 1,600 people for a 16-year-old. Okay, so it doesn't matter how long you're on this earth for. You can touch a lot of people in a very short period of time, and I've seen that. But people should be there should be a eulogy for at least everyone, because people deserve it. So.
Well, thank you for joining us, and thank you for bringing this and helping us touch many people with this perspective that we all have to face. And there are better ways to do it than not. So thank you for being our guest, and thank you to our audience for always showing up and participating and listening to these kind of conversations. We thank you, and we wish you a fantastic evening.
Thank you.
Thank you for taking the time to start your journey of thinking differently and listening to LBW talk about stuff they love. Until next time.